Votes for Women here, this is where I usually say that it ends on June 7th, but we're lucky to know that it's not going to end on June 7th. We're pushing it to September 27th is our new closing date, so there is time to get back into the museum and see a few things, hopefully, and everything will go smoothly. All of our lenders have been really generous in extending their loans and letting us keep these objects for much longer. And in fact, I think, you know, we're still trying to sort out what the next gallery change will be. And we know that the companion exhibition will actually go until November. So we have lots of time to see these couple of exhibitions yet. So the first thing that I wanted to bring up was a section of the exhibition that I call How to Read a Picture. It's a cartoon, a political cartoon called A Female Suffrage Fancy. And it's the very first thing when you first walk in the door on the right-hand side. And I wanted to take you through a little bit of how we do that. So here's the object itself, right? It's a page, a double spread from Puck magazine. And it's great, but in real life, it's, you know, 14 inches across, and it doesn't demand a lot of attention on the wall, and it's filled with tiny details. And so I wanted to make a way to draw you in to look at this a little bit more closely and also explain what's going on. And we had a question that came from Allison Clements, and I think this is part of my answer to Allison's question. Her question was, since the Brandywine is known as a museum for American art, what first gave you the idea to assemble an exhibit in which specific painting or group of paintings is not the centerpiece? And did you meet with any resistance along the way? Well, so this object, this print, really, to me, answers part of that question when anyone would ask why an art museum would be working on a suffrage exhibition. It's because so much of the suffrage arguments, pro and con, were communicated by visual means. And that could be through paintings or political cartoons, illustrations in magazines. It could be through postcards. It could be through costume, through film. And so the idea of communicating visually is what I thought was the most important aspect of our suffrage exhibition. It's what made our suffrage exhibition different from others at different museums. And so even though we usually look at paintings in our collection and drawings and prints and sometimes sculpture, behind all of that is the idea that those visual objects, visual images carry messages. And this was a great idea or a great opportunity to bring together those objects that were all about the same idea, about suffrage, and see how different artists, different designers, different groups and organizations used visual imagery. So in this particular print that appeared in Puck magazine, and it is in fact the earliest print. Mary, I just thought of this. You have clicked the record button, yes? I just wanted to make sure that we're capturing that because I kind of forgot about it too.
We're capturing, thank you.
Yes, yes. This first appeared in Puck magazine, and it is in fact the earliest object in our exhibition. And as you can see, this little magazine spread is absolutely filled with drawings and pictures and images, and there's captions and there's text within it. So I thought about how to draw your attention to this in the exhibition. And so we worked with a designer to figure out how to essentially make this object bigger than it was in real life. So here's our real life design, our drawing from the designers that shows exactly where it would be there in the exhibition next to the exit sign. And there's the print in the middle, but you can see, and if you've been to the gallery, you know there's a lot of didactic information that goes around this object. And so here's the graphic that we designed to include the actual object there in the center. And you see, we get super detailed. We decided right there that the center line of the object should be 56 inches off the floor. And then each of these little individual details is drawn from the individual or from the different aspects of the main drawing. And the paragraph that's next to it is where I describe all the visual arguments that are being made in that caption. You realize when they say a picture worth 1,000 words, I think I hit 1,000 words at least on this picture and all this text here. And so this was the installation process. The graphic comes in first because we don't want any, you know, sign hangers or print shop guys around when we're actually installing the artwork. It's just too dangerous. So it goes in and we installed the object right over top of that, crossing our fingers that it would fit in the middle that we had all measured correctly. There it is, making its way into the exhibition, and you see our plans are sort of tacked right up on the wall so we know where everything's supposed to go on the entire wall as we're proceeding. And you see it's not a big image, but we put a big mat on it, and then we placed it right in the middle of that, and that's the entire display. So I just wanted to take you right into that image and just deal with the central image just for a minute to give you an idea of how we can read a picture, and how I know that with our history of illustration at the Brandywine, a lot of you are used to reading pictures as being part of a story and explaining or having a narrative. All of those things are present in this image as well. So we look really closely at just the center part of that image. And there are tiny details that takes this, it's tough to even see when you're there without getting too close. And so I wanted to walk you through this central figure, which is captioned, "Lovely woman having removed her political disabilities is prepared to vote." And so you look, and the first thing you see is that that central figure is not a man, but it is, in fact, a woman dressed up as a man. Clearly, she's disregarded or tossed off her disabilities, i.e. everything that makes her a woman. And if we look at a few of the details right here, she is standing on her books of female deportment and modesty. So she has completely disregarded those things. And she's tossed the cookbook off to the side here. We'll talk about the makeup here in a minute, but while you can see it, she's got tossed her makeup aside as well. And the houseplant here in the front, it is dead as a doornail. I mean, that's just a teeny little detail, but if you think about that famous painting, American Gothic by Grant Wood, one of the tiny details in that painting is the thriving, wonderful houseplants on the porch in the background. That's supposed to be the presence of a good housewife or farm wife in that house who takes care of the plants, who takes care of the house. And clearly our woman in this image has left that houseplant to die. Over on the right-hand side of my image here, I've got a detail that shows how she's tossed off those high button boots. She's got these manly boots on now. She's tossed off her gown, and then you see up on the corner of the the armchair is her corset. How risque to show this corset and suggest that she's just undressed. And of course, the fashion papers are all out the door with her political disabilities. Little couple of other details. Of course, we're looking and seeing here how she is dressed as a man, right? But if you look a little bit more closely, she's got whiskers right there. And you come over to the bureau and you see that she has cigars that she's reaching for. There's tobacco behind the mirror tucked away. There's a pipe here and another on the dresser. So she is a smoking and, dare I say, drinking woman as well, because those are not bottles of perfume on her bureau. She's got decanters as well. And I think my next image will show you, if I get it right, yes, her beard grease that she has purchased, and this flyer about how to force whiskers to grow so she can in fact be ready to vote, is the satire of this particular cartoonist. So that is a jam-packed image. Almost nothing in this drawing is without some relationship to the context of the exhibition, or of the theme of a female suffrage fancy, this futuristic world where women could vote. And if you look around the rest of the image, all those little vignettes all around it have the same sort of story along with them. So I wanted to transition that image, which talks about how clothing really helped to express your political beliefs, whether you're a manly woman who wants to vote. But we learned, or I learned in doing this exhibition, how much clothing and style and costume could also express your desire to vote. And so I brought a few, instead of the typical press release pictures, today I brought some of the photos that I took as we were putting this exhibition together. And so costume is new to me to installing, so I thought it was absolutely hilarious to see the legs with their boots, or the arms with or the hands with their gloves. You can see over on the left-hand side, here's a set of legs ready to go on these mannequins. These are the women that are in, or the mannequins that are in the display to represent women wearing white costumes to march in suffrage parades. And women wearing white up to today often reflects their political aspirations, their defiance of a patriarchy, their desire to unite and work together for a common goal. But I thought I'd share some of these exhibition behind the scenes images as well. Costume, it came into play a great deal in this exhibition, more so than I thought it would. And I think it's been really successful to bring almost like physical human presences into the galleries. And you are, well, I'd say you're allowed to be within 6 feet of them, but our registrar might think you should stay back a little more than 6 feet. This is my ironing board here, because we literally dressed the mannequins there in the gallery, and we took good care to do everything. We had a supervisor, conservator, a textile conservator, we had a costume curator, and so it was the most careful dressing I have ever done of anything. And a couple people have commented on the fact that I put purple hair on the mannequins. I did that because you get to pick the hair color when you do these things, because I wanted to represent not only the colors of the National Women's Party, but I wanted to represent the way that these women who were demonstrating for their rights and being so outspoken were breaking all kinds of norms. And my friend Ivy here, who works for the National Women's Party, came to the opening of the Votes for Women exhibition, and I did not plan this, but she had also dyed her hair purple. And I think you see that, you know, when you see Ivy in a museum or walking down the street, you kind of get the idea that she's like cutting edge and fashion forward and, you know, young and vibrant and modern. And that's the same idea that I wanted to get on those mannequins, because we were looking at 100-year-old clothing. So I wanted to bring it up to date a little bit. One of the questions we had ahead of time was about the capes, and a lot of people are interested in the capes. And so instead of showing you the finished capes, here is our textile conservator and our preparator, Emilio, working on installing them. And we were dressing them and deciding where they should be and which one should be in front and how far open the cape should be. But the question that came up was, who owns the capes now, and were they donated by an individual woman, or did someone gather them up after a march? So these particular capes all come from the National Women's Party, which is one of the two major suffrage organizations that existed in this country at the time that the 19th Amendment was passed. It was an offshoot of the other organization, which was a little stuffier and a little more conservative. They were called NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. But the National Women's Party was a bit younger and a bit more bold in their publicity and in their activities. And so marching in purple capes was right up their alley. And they had commissioned, as you see the banners up above, they either handmade or had made for them these capes. And I'm certain that some women would have made their own, but because they were made by the National Women's Party, they were owned by the National Women's Party, they were given out at marches and at rallies for people to wear for certain events, but all came home at the end of the day. And in fact, they still belong to the National Women's Party. And so the National Women's Party has a home in Washington, D.C. It's across the street from the Capitol building and next to the Hart Senate offices. And it's called the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument is the house where it's where it's located. So these and the flags, the banners that you see came from their collections. And I think there's a reason. You see a little variation. Sometimes there's a white interior, sometimes there's a gold interior, sometimes there's a white collar, sometimes it's a purple collar. And I think those are just natural variations. We measured them all. They're all a little bit different in length. So some of them might have been tailored to individual women. So that wasn't cut from a single pattern or made by a manufacturer. So I think it's great to bring the handmade aspect of these works in as much as we can, because it's women who were making these objects as well. Now, I have a couple of views of the capes here. One of the other questions I get asked a lot, and there was a couple versions of it in our questions today, was how women of color participated in and were included, or I should say not included many times, in the suffrage movement, and I'll add in the ensuing suffrage historical narrative. And so the first question I wanted to address was from Susanna Wirtz, who asks, how were people of color included in the suffrage movement? So this is the area inside the gallery where we try and deal with that question, because though women of color were involved in the suffrage movement was not very well integrated. So you usually see photographs or evidence that's of an all-white group or an all-African-American group or an all-Asian group. It's not very integrated. And so I wanted to bring you some of those fascinating pictures that rarely get seen in traditional suffrage narratives. And so this photograph in the center here is the Delta Sigma Theta. That's an African-American sorority class from 1913. That's their founding year. They were founded in January 1913 at Howard University, and they're the second African-American sorority. The Alphas, the previous sorority, again, had this kind of more conservative, more different set of viewpoints than a group of young women who were involved there, but then wanted to be more politically active, wanted to be more active in their communities. And so they splintered from the Alphas and created Delta Sigma Theta. And their first action as a sorority at Howard University was to march in the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. And that caused a lot of questions and concerns within the broader suffrage movement, because it brought to a head the idea that African-American women wanted to join the suffrage movement, and predominant and prevailing racial ideologies meant that not everyone was willing to accept them. In fact, and I don't have a detail of it, but this cartoon right here to the right of the Delta Sigma Theta image is a cartoon that appeared in a New York newspaper just a couple of days before the Washington March. And it's asking, it has two women in it, and one is a white woman and one is a black woman, and they both hold the exact same sign, Votes for Women, but the white woman is holding up her hand and not letting the African-American woman join the march. And the caption is, Votes for White Women. And it's absolutely true that some of the prevailing biases of society were reflected in the suffrage movement. So the other aspect of the African-American suffrage movement that is absolutely worthwhile studying, because it differs from the mainstream suffrage movement, is represented in the image to the left here. This is the African-American activist and suffragist Nannie Helen Burroughs. She is holding a banner that is the Banner State Baptist Convention sign. Now, if you don't look closely at it, you see a line of women in white clothing holding banners and you think suffragists. But in fact, these were women that were gathered under the auspices of a Baptist convention, but they were all in support of suffrage as well. So the African-American and the women of color suffrage movement is much more intersectional. It overlaps with racial, religious, social, all sorts of other issues that these women were tackling all at once. Racism, of course, being one of them. And so I think I have a little detail off to the side here to offer of the rest of the wall. The two other images that you saw in that previous slide over, I'm pointing at my screen as if you can see it, are a painting and a political cartoon. So I wanted to just bring you those in greater detail because it leads to the next question, or another question I was asked. On the left-hand side is a painting by the African-American artist Lottie Wilson, who was the first person of color to attend the Art Institute of Chicago. And on the right-hand side is a political cartoon that first appeared in Memphis, Tennessee, in a newspaper, and then was distributed much more widely. You see, it's marked as Memphis Commercial Appeal. That's where it was first published, but it was reprinted in the Topeka, Kansas newspaper later in that year. The original publication happened just after the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was in August of 1920 in Tennessee. So that's an important connection. On the left-hand side in Lottie Wilson's painting, we see a portrait of Abraham Lincoln and Sojourner Truth, and it's a scene from history. When Lottie Wilson painted this, she was not a witness to this scene, but she was recalling the famous meeting between Lincoln and Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth is often remembered as an abolitionist, but in fact, she was a huge supporter of women's rights. And one of her greatest speeches that we know most today is her "Ain't I a Woman" speech, asking for women's rights, not just African Americans' rights. I'll tell you a little bit more about Lottie Wilson in a minute, but I wanted to show you this political cartoon because it lays it out very straightforward. Here we have the suffrage amendment has passed. African American women are going to be, in theory, allowed to vote in Tennessee. And here you have the big, old Southern anti-suff up on a chair, scared to death of the tiny little mouse that's labeled "Negro Women Vote." And that was a frightening potential reality for the white men ensconced in politics in the South at this time, that their way of life and their way of doing things and their political control was going to be now challenged by something as small as giving the women the vote. The image on the left of Lottie Wilson kind of leads into this discussion of a wall, the mural that we created. And so this also answers the question about how were women of color included in the movement. I tried to bring out in the exhibition some of the ways you could have seen in primary documents women of color at work in the suffrage movement. But then stepping back, we realized the evidence is so very small and so very limited that we thought it was a great opportunity to add to that limited amount of especially visual discourse by commissioning artists to create portraits of important women of color, or women whose activities have been hidden for so long because of their ethnicity, because of their racial identity. And right there in the center of the image, you see a portrait that the Brandywine commissioned of that artist, Lottie Wilson. And let me see if I can get this correct here. So I'm showing you both the final version of the Lottie Wilson portrait on the right-hand side and one of the studies that the artist Laura Freeman, who is a children's book illustrator working in Atlanta, Georgia, created for this. And we went back and forth about the position, the pose, the backgrounds, that sort of thing. We had an art director. It wasn't just me picking these things. And so you see how it changed from one to the other. And I love that Laura Freeman, as an artist herself, remembered or thought how important it was to include the paintbrush in Lottie Wilson's hand, because, you know, as a good art historian, we're always trained on Renaissance art and learning all the different saints in Renaissance art by their attributes, by what they're holding. I always remember St. Lucy and her eyes on a plate, or St. Catherine of, gosh, and I got this wrong on an exam in college. St. Catherine, I mixed up my St. Catharines. I was supposed to know one of them had a wheel because she had been martyred on a wheel, and one of them wore a ring as the bride of Christ, and I mixed them up. But here, our saint, Lottie Wilson, holds her paintbrush as her attribute. And this brings me to one of the questions that someone else asked, which woman of color, this is from Barbara Snyder, which woman of color in the exhibit was most significant or surprised you? And I'm going to say Lottie Wilson, because I never expected to find a prominent in her own community female African-American suffragist who was also such an important artist as well. And then I really didn't expect to be able to have one of her paintings in our exhibition. Lottie Wilson's history is very little known, but in Michigan, she is in the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame as a suffragist for her activities. She was a portrait painter, and she made her living as a portrait painter, which is highly unusual, because if you think about it, and those of you who are guides at the Brandywine know that someone like Henriette Wyeth made her living as a portrait painter because she was connected to the Society Women of Wilmington, Delaware. And when she moved to New Mexico, she lost her patronage. And so you have to think that if Lottie Wilson was a successful, supporting herself African-American portraitist, there was a patronage out there for her as well. It opens up a whole new field of study for figuring out how an artist would choose, or how a sitter chooses an artist. And if an African-American family is going to be more likely than not to select Lottie Wilson to do their portrait because of the affinities they share and the life experiences they share. Now, as I said, Lottie Wilson's story was really surprising to me, but getting that painting by her in the exhibition proved even more surprising. Some of you have heard me talk about comparing the painting to other versions of it, but I wanted to show you in my little behind the scenes talk here, the back of the painting. And this is something that I photographed in the minutes before it went off on the wall and kind of forgot about until this morning. There's a note attached to the back of this painting, and it says, and this is a kind of note we find on a lot of paintings that talks about the materials or that were used to conserve it, when it was conserved, and who the conservator was. That's part of best practices for conservation, to leave a paper trail. But what this reveals is the foam core backing can be removed with a screwdriver to reveal the reverse of the painting and the following printed inscription through the fiberglass lining. So we didn't take the back off, but I took this picture just to remind me. Painted and presented to President Roosevelt by Lottie E. Wilson, Niles, Michigan, 1902. That much I had read about, but I didn't believe it because it wasn't in the White House collection any longer. In fact, there was only a photograph of it in the White House collection. But here's the next part. Then, given to Major Loeffler by President Roosevelt in 1902. Well, I don't know who that is, but I'm sure going to look him up now. So even once the work of art gets to our building, there's still more research and things to learn about it. None of the literature and no one who owned this painting mentioned to me this note about Major Loeffler. So I'm curious to follow up on that. The rest of it says it's important to reattach the backing because it is an excellent projection against dust, attracting moisture and damage. And it's signed by the conservator who treated this painting in 1999. So that is my presentation to try and answer some of the questions we had ahead of time. And I'm going to stop sharing and take it back to the whole group here and see if anybody has more questions, either about what they saw or even, like I promised at the beginning, that ask a question, ask anything to a curator question.
Amanda, we had a question that came in the chat from Patty Boyd. Where did I write it down? Here it is. The Western states granted women voting rights before the passage, some of the Western states granted women voting rights before the passage of the 19th Amendment. And why was that?
Mm-hmm.
And why?
Well, you know, the answer I was giving as a general answer early on had to do just with Western states needing citizenship right? If they counted women as citizens and gave them the vote, it upped their citizenship and it gave them better representation. But to drill down into that even further, if you attended Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's talk, that's a simple answer. One of the other aspects is, for instance, I think it was Montana, needed to give women the vote for that citizenship so that they could become a state. No, it was Wyoming, so that they could become a state. They were only a territory, and they needed a certain level of citizenship, of population to even get permission to become a state. But then there were other aspects that she brought up about how, for instance, in Utah, Mormonism was widely affiliated with the state. There's a great Mormon population in the state of Utah, but Utah also gave women the right to vote. So it was almost like an attraction maybe to some people to move to Western states to get the vote. I think California, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, they were some of the very first states decades before here on the East Coast, when the rest of us got it. And I think it does have to do with a greater flexibility of power in those states, right? So everything is kind of set in stone, and the legislatures and the political machine is all already set up on the East Coast by the time women start agitating for their rights to vote. But it is literally the Wild West in the Wild West, and anything could go. And the idea that you could petition for suffrage and maybe get it passed. I mean, I learned stories about African American women gold miners in this period who were agitating for suffrage. I didn't even know there were African American women gold miners out west. So there are so many more stories in the Western states than we've always learned in our succinct histories of the Revolutionary War, and then the Pilgrims came, and then Jamestown happened, and the Revolution happened, and that kind of like mid-Atlantic history we're always learning. Hi, Jim.
If anybody has additional questions, you can, if you want to unmute yourself. Oh, wait, we have one in the chat too. Alan Goodman has asked, how many of the portraits did the museum commission for the show? 14, and if I had been able to squeeze more money, we would have had 20 or 30. I think it was hard to limit that. I mean, the more, it seemed like the more research you did, the more deserving women were discovered. Yeah, and so in the end, the selection was trying to get a balance of maybe a woman or two you had heard of, like Sojourner Truth. Women you certainly hadn't heard of, we had plenty of them. Local women like Edith Cuff Black, who's from Wilmington, Delaware, or statewide important women like, well, in various states, but in Pennsylvania we had several women that were possible, and I selected Alice Dunbar Nelson, who had petitioned, an African-American woman who had worked on the suffrage campaign in Pennsylvania in 1915. But then we went to bigger national stories too, especially women who are involved in the historically Black colleges and universities in their early days, some of the early professors and librarians from those, and then even international stories with Mabel Pinghua Lee, who was a Chinese immigrant who had come to the United States, and others who had then returned to their native countries and took suffrage with them. So it became a local, national, and international. And so that was the kind of balance. I thought, well, I have too many international stories. I've got to do another local story. Well, Nia asks a good follow-up question to that. She wants to know, is this inspiring a spin-off exhibition or efforts? It seems like it opened up a lot of avenues for you, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on it. Thank you, Nia. And the few staff members that are here will have heard me already
not complaining, but worrying before the exhibition opened, that if this exhibition wasn't successful, we wouldn't do exhibitions like this in the future. And by that, I mean more visual culture, more about women's history, more about the history of people of color, not just what was in my Jansen's History of Art textbook, because frankly, Jansen's been about this much of American art in these big, broad history of the world, the world's art. And so I would love to see more objects and costumes to tell the whole story of whatever we're talking about. So our upcoming exhibitions have the potential to do that as well. So Audrey is working on an exhibition called Fragile Earth, which is like our Natural Wonders exhibition a couple of years ago, that asks contemporary artists who are also naturalists, so they're scientists and artists, to use their art making to help explain their interest in the natural world. And, you know, hopefully there's another exhibition that I'm working on Ralston Crawford, and I've just written the essay for it recently, and it's about the artist as a spy, about how Ralston Crawford's artistic and design skills helped the very first iteration of the CIA during World War II. So there's bigger histories that are connected to art as well.
Great. Let's see, do we have anyone else have a question?
So Mary, can I plug the lecture series that we're going to do?
I was just going to do that, but I think
why don't you go ahead?
Want me to do it?
Yeah, sure.
So we always want to know more, right? So for more information on Amanda's research, and I think part of the fascinating story for me has been the story behind this exhibition. The exhibition I knew would be really interesting and that I would learn quite a bit, but I didn't expect to learn so much just about how this might be researched. And some of you may have come to Amanda's lecture that she gave on February 19th, if any of you can remember back that far. February 19th in person, many of us attended a lecture that Amanda gave called Seeing Suffrage with 2020 Vision. And part of the story of that was the story behind this exhibition, how she delved into these different sources from the National Archives and from many other places, and found this amazing, all these amazing primary sources and visual information. So when things shut down, we asked Amanda to create a virtual version of that, a recorded version of that lecture, because there were a lot of questions that the lecture raised. And there were some great ideas she gave us that day about how to do some more research on our own if you wanted to go to some of those sources. So Amanda has put this into a recorded form. We have a 3-part lecture series. It's available on Brandywine's website. You need to follow the link. You go to Brandywine at Home, then the virtual events, and you'll see Seeing Suffrage with 2020 Vision. You sign up, and then you will get links to the 3 lectures, which you can do at your own pace, whenever it's convenient for you. Those links are going to be available through the end of September. So you have some time. I think we all have some time to do some learning during this period. And so I'd recommend that. And I believe also there's some more information on that page about how to access some of these sources on your own, because you know, it kind of makes you want to solve some mysteries yourself and delve into some of this research. Is that right, Amanda? Yes,
and I should say it's free. I'm always getting these advertisements for webinars, and I click on it and was like, it's what? $500? Yeah. And, so it's free. It's there. All you have to do is register the way that Mary described, and even though it says checkout and payment, it's all free. And so even if you did attend the lecture, what I did was, after that lecture, so many people asked about the links that I used and how could they do this, and different projects that I mentioned, like the transcription project that the Library of Congress is doing. And so I split the lecture into 3 parts. So it's a shorter version, but there's more detail. And then afterwards, I follow up with just a little me on my computer recording and giving you the links that I used in the lecture and showing you those websites and how they work, just a little bit So you can get familiar with it. If you wanted to transcribe some women's historical documents for the Library of Congress, I also have a couple of other transcription projects. Or if you wanted to search through the suffrage holdings at the National Woman's Party like I did, or if you wanted to read archival documents from Tennessee from that summer of ratification, they're all there, amazingly digitized for you to look at.
Oh, that's great. When we're all finished with our baking projects, we will get onto that. And we're just about to conclude here, but I had one other question, Amanda. I wondered if you could have tea with one of these women who led the suffrage movement, who would it be and why? Like what person that you researched through this did you most think, wow, I wish I could have really interviewed her in person or met her?
I'm glad you asked. I said to Mary, I almost was late to this because I was watching a video. And I was watching a video thinking about this idea of who I might like to meet. And I think I landed on today, the suffragist Lucy Burns. And she's a lesser known name. She is represented in the exhibition. There's a photograph of her in prison. And so usually that's what she's known for, is one of the founders of the National Woman's Party who was imprisoned as a silent sentinel. And she, in fact, was the woman who spent the most time in jail. And she was given the maximum sentence of 7 months for obstructing the sidewalk during her protest. And so I was doing a little bit more research on Lucy Burns, and I think she's going to get more well known because just this year, as a matter of fact, the grand opening was supposed to have been May 9th. There was a preview back in January. A new museum dedicated to Lucy Burns is opening just outside Washington, D.C., at the site of the prison where the suffragists were imprisoned. And so that entire complex has been repurposed into an arts center. It's called the Workhouse Arts Center, but they've preserved one of the cell blocks, they call them quaintly dormitories, that women had been imprisoned in, and they have named that the Lucy Burns Museum. And you can learn a lot more about her and about the suffragists who had been imprisoned there. But just learning more about her, doing my research, she was, she wanted to be an English teacher. She just loved learning. She went to colleges all over the place. She went to Columbia, she went to Vassar, she went to Yale, she went to Oxford. She learned German and went to the University of Bonn and the University of Berlin, all while doing this women's suffrage, project as well. And it just seems to me like she is a fascinating character that I didn't really know about before starting this. And I think because she was so committed and she's just getting recognized for her efforts, I would love to go and fill in some of the blanks about what really happened in certain times and places by talking to her.
That sounds amazing. Yes. I remember reading about her, I think it was in the Women's Hour, that book.
Yep.
And she was definitely a very strong part of the movement, but as you say, not one of the ones that maybe has as much of a national presence and is known everywhere.
Yeah, she had been jailed in England for protesting for suffrage, and she went on a hunger strike there and was force-fed. And so the same thing happened in Washington when she was arrested, and she led protests within the prison, which precipitated the prison guards moving to her to a different cell block, so she couldn't organize the women anymore. And then they told the women, oh, Lucy quit her hunger strike. You guys can all quit your hunger strikes too, when she was meanwhile being force-fed in another part of the prison.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And before we finish up, one other thing I want to let people know that Nicole's reminding me, which is great information, is that we have weekly mini tours of the Votes for Women exhibition on Facebook. Those are generally on Wednesdays on Facebook. And you can also find a nice list of these on that Brandywine at home page on the website. So be sure to go, if you haven't been there yet, be sure to go to Brandywine's website and click on the Brandywine at home, and you'll see all kinds of things that you can be doing, coloring pages, art activities, as well as learning more about suffrage and some new works and interesting works in our collection as well. We're also very open to any ideas you may have for programs like this. So if anyone has thoughts on that, please, you can reach out to Brandywine. Our emails are all on the website. Mine is maryc@brandywine.org. But please do reach out and give us your suggestions. We're very open to ideas for more learning opportunities during this time.